Now we come to the time when Cuthbert Pratt became rector. He was named acting rector after Stark's departure, and the vestry began looking for a new rector. I think they were very much concerned about the churchmanship issue, and that they get someone who would stand up to any pressure from Bishop Conkling. And the vestry knew that Cuthbert Pratt was, like Stark, a very strong Low Churchman. And in those days, it was not very common, but it was not unheard of that an assistant could be called to succeed as rector. Now that is, with the current search committee process, that's totally not possible, but in 1950 it was rare, though not completely unheard of. And Conkling was not happy about this, and the vestry came to see him about it, and they put on very heavy pressure, and Conkling finally gave way and allowed the call to go through, and on June 6, 1950, Pratt accepted the call. He had the Sunday school in the last days of Dudley Stark's rectorship, and so I knew him better than I had Stark. He was born in Britain and had a very distinctive British accent, had a beautiful speaking voice. I can remember that when he would read the liturgy, it was, you didn't think, oh, how well he read it. He did it so well that it was just, you thought about, oh, aren't those beautiful words? It didn't seem like, it was he was just conveying the words so well. Like Stark, he was an excellent preacher, and he had a very dry sense of humor, and this was sometimes reflected in his sermons. I remember one that he preached just before going on his vacation in the summer, and it was about taking God on your vacation, and he quoted some Ogden Nash poem, "Bather, bather, burning bright." And he was also a very good pastor. And one member of the congregation years later told me that her mother had died very early on Easter morning. And although he was to have to do 3 services at the church later, he came over to see the family before going to the early service. He was not married at the time he had been called as rector, but it was well known that he had been engaged for some time to a young woman in the New York area, and sometime that summer the congregation all received invitations to his wedding, which was to be at Trinity Church, with Dudley Stark officiating. And his wife Ethel, after their honeymoon, came back to St. Chrysostom's with him, and she wanted to get acquainted with the congregation as soon as possible, and she would go to all the meetings of groups that she could. And she went to the business and professional women, and one of the members there questioned her and said, "Have you ever worked? You do know this is a group for working women, don't you?" And it was not acceptable that she should just come in and try to get acquainted. And she said, "Well, I'm not working now, but I did work before I was married." And then this woman relaxed and said, "Okay." Thanksgiving service that year was at St. Chrysostom's, and they got Bishop Keeler to come back as the preacher. And Pratt did not immediately hire a full-time assistant, which was of some concern to the vestry, and one can understand why, because in some of the records there are statistics for his first year as rector: 265 services of Holy Communion, morning prayer and evening prayer, 110 sermons, 18 private services of Holy Communion, and 132 other services. The Reverend William Morris, who was also a student at U of C Divinity School, became assistant in spring 1951, but after a few months he had to resign because he said he couldn't keep up with his parish duties and his studies, and the studies for him took priority. So from then on, for the next several months, we had a lot of guest preachers, one being the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Southern Brazil, who gave a very good sermon, and a member of the congregation, after hearing this, was moved to go into the mission field and left a year or so later to work with the bishop in southern Brazil. But in June, the Reverend Donald Nixon was hired as the assistant, and he had just graduated from General Seminary and was ordained to be deacon but not a priest. And we had had ordination of deacons and bishops, and one bishop at St. Chrysostom's, but there had never been an ordination to the priesthood. And Nixon had a wife and 3 children, didn't want to go back to his home diocese of Western New York for ordination, and so the ordination was scheduled at the 11 o'clock service, December 14th, 1952. Bishop Scaife from Western New York came, and for what was probably the first time in history, they had a reception afterward with coffee and light refreshments. The Nixons' 3 small children were sometimes could cause problems. There was they had a daughter, and then they had twin boys who were about a year and a half when he came. And I heard from 2 sources about how once they had crawled out a window of the assistant's apartment and crawled onto the parish roof. And Sunday school teachers could see them, but couldn't do anything to stop them, and they were scared to death that the kids were going to fall, but somebody got them back in without any problem. For a number of years, there had been reports that the organ was giving problems, and in the early 1950s, they came up with 3 possible proposals. The one was a Aeolian Skinner organ, new. The second was renovation of the existing organ by a group called Austin Organs. And the third was an organ from the Canadian firm Cassavant. This was the cheapest and could also be done in the least time. Also, it was said that Harold Simons, who was very much a Mr. Nice Guy, didn't push as much as he should have for either of the 2 other choices, which would musically have been better, but said, sure, let's go with the Cassavant. The new organ was first used on November 8th, 1953, and at the Founders' Day service in January 1954, it was dedicated. Simons had been featured in an article in the Tribune in April 1953, Chicago church bells to chime Easter nears. Since the 18th century, with its Bachs and Handels, music has become as much a part of Easter as the lily. If Bach and Handel contributed much to Easter music, so too have many others. For instance, Gillette and Johnson, English bellfounders, make one of the world's finest carillons, and the Simons family of Boston has produced one of America's best carillonneurs. Rather nice to be compared with Bach and Handel. The rest of the article goes on, and Simons describes techniques of playing the carillon. Simon's first wife had died in 1950, and I didn't know her, but she was apparently very nice. And Simon's in the early 50s started showing up in very stylish outfits, and this may very well have been because he was seeing a woman who was a member of the choir and who was confirmed at St. Chrysostom's in 1953, and they were married a short time later, and this marriage too was exceptionally happy. Simons had celebrated his 30th anniversary at St. Chrysostom's in 1954, and the parish had given him a gold watch for the occasion. 1954 was a very good year for Cuthbert Pratt. On Palm Sunday, he announced before he began his sermon that his son Christopher had been born earlier on that day. And later in the month, he made another announcement. BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, was about to begin single-plane service from Chicago to London. A man from the congregation who, with his wife, were good friends of the Pratts, worked for BOAC, and he got them to agree that it would be good publicity for the new service if Cuthbert Pratt could be sent on the first trip to fly to London with a message for the Bishop of London. The Bishop of London had been the one before the American Revolution, had been in charge of the colonial churches, so he was felt that he was an appropriate one to receive the message. I'm sure Ethel would have been included. They would have had round trip for two, but since Christopher was not yet a month old, it was not feasible for her to make the trip. When he came back, he preached a very moving sermon. It was the first time that he had been back to England since his family had emigrated sometime in the 1930s. And in addition to giving his message to the Bishop of London and attending services at London churches, he had been able to go back to the city, the town where his family had come from, and meet the relatives and remember some of the ones who were gone. And his sermon on this was very moving. And he took as the text, "Are not two sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore you are of more value than many sparrows." The English farthing with a sparrow on the coin had just been eliminated as legal tender, and he was able to get this big bag of farthings at minimal cost, and he brought that back and gave a farthing that was given to everyone in the congregation that Sunday. And he also brought a flask of water from the Thames back, which was used when Christopher was baptized. 1955 saw a new organization at St. Chrysostom's, the Ushers Guild. It well, the ushers, I think, had been drawn pretty much from the vestry before that, but the Ushers Guild had 4 teams, and you were assigned to a team, and they listed the names of the ushers in the bulletin each Sunday, and Nixon left in 1955, and his successor was the Reverend Charles Summers, whose wife Lorraine had a degree in music, and she sang in the choir and worked with the young people, the group that had sometimes sung music at the Service League performances, and they reorganized the young adults into a group with several subgroups, and most of these didn't really last that long, but the music and drama group under Lorraine Summers' leadership really did go on and do quite a good job. The group put on several Gilbert and Sullivan performances, and after the Summers left, they found another person who got involved with the group, which became known as the Chris Singers, and they didn't do any more Gilbert and Sullivan, but they worked with the Sunday school in performing a music at a Christmas pageant, and they dramatized the O. Henry story about the gift of the Magi. In 1954, the World Council of Churches had an international assembly in Evanston, which got quite a bit of publicity, and the same week as that was to begin, the American Bar Association convention in Chicago was also to start. And the Service League decided to put on a coffee hour after the service, expecting that there would be a lot of visitors. And they had it in the parish dining room, which is the room now just to the north of the kitchen on the 2nd floor. And people were very complimentary about it. I assume the visitors liked it, but the parishioners liked it very much too. And they started having them on special occasions fairly frequently. The big problem was that there were logistics issues. They did not at this time have an elevator in the building, and there was not any kind of a kitchen on the 1st floor. So you either had to make the coffee upstairs and bring it down, or people had to walk up the stairs to get to the coffee hour, and they had it in the dining room, but they'd sometimes have it in the guild room or the gym or what's now the Harding room. And by 1957, a vestry member and his wife, Carol and Helga Harding, who were very strong supporters of the coffee hour, gave to have a small kitchen where you could make coffee installed in what was then the north room, and they also arranged for it to be refurnished. The only furnishings that had been there for many years were rows of folding chairs with wooden, and the veneer on them was coming off, and women had to be very careful when sitting down because you could very easily snag your stockings. Now, Carol Harding got furnishings from the Pullman Company, and these were the kind of chairs and sofas that were used in the Pullman cars on the train, and they were very heavy so that they couldn't be jerked around easily, and so they were very hard to move, but it was still orders of magnitude above what had been in the past. And after this room was redone, they started having coffee hours regularly. And Harding retired from Pullman the next spring, and at the suggestion of the Women's Guild, which the vestry approved, they changed the name of the former North Room to the Harding Room in honor of their contribution. At this time, there was beginning to be kind of an odd feeling in the parish. By 1956, people were getting not very happy about the idea of having the annual meeting on a weekday in the rector's study. The minutes of that meeting record a woman who had a young daughter in Sunday school saying, "Why is not the congregation ever told these things that are being mentioned at this annual meeting? We know nothing about it," and she wasn't happy. And a working woman said, "Why do they have to have the meeting at a afternoon when many people can't come?" And the reply was just that it wasn't feasible to change it, but this didn't sit well with a number of people. In 1957, Pratt had received 2 honorary degrees, one from Seabury and one from Hobart, and the vestry read into the minutes a very laudatory citation that accompanied the Hobart degree and said, in effect, this is completely accurate. However, things came up after that time. There was a vacancy on the vestry, and the man proposed by the nominating committee was a sensible choice. He was a contractor, and there was talk about a capital campaign in the not-too-distant future. But there were people in the congregation who were not happy, and a second candidate was proposed, and he also had good experience and was a longtime member of the parish, but perhaps less suitable in this particular circumstance. And at the annual meeting, the vestry candidate, the contractor, was elected, but something had happened, and less than a week after the annual meeting, Pratt announces to the congregation that he has accepted a call to become rector of Holy Trinity Church in New York City. And the reason that the family gave was that the relatives on both sides of the family were in the East, and they wanted to be able to be closer to them. But I and many people suspected that this was not the full story. There was some dispute about vacation time that came up, and that may have had some effect. In later years, I think he felt that he perhaps should not have left St. Chrysostom's. He kept very close touch with what was going on at the church, which had its bad points but also its good points. He was on the mailing list to get bulletins, and he'd see these things and he'd write back. We kept in touch with him, and why on earth are they doing this? We never would have done this when I was rector, sort of thing. But what was a very good thing was that he kept up his ties to parishioners, and they really appreciated this. And he would call if he heard that somebody was ill, or sometimes he would come back and perform funerals for former parishioners, and many people said that he was like a member of their family. I would always go and see the Pratts. If I was in the East, I'd try to get first to New York, and then a few years later he went to Holy Trinity Church in Philadelphia, and we'd always have a nice get-together. And last time I did this, I remember the Pratts were asking, well, what is the news from people we know? And a couple in the congregation, who at that time were in their 70s, had bought a lottery ticket. It was one of these scratch-off ones, and what they won was a week's trip to Disney World. And they thought this was the funniest thing. And they said, you know, we may not want to go and see much of Disney World, but hey, we can take this. This was in the fall. We can get away from the bad winter in Chicago for a week. And Cuthbert Pratt just laughed his head off when he heard this, and he said, well, you tell them when you go back that we will be expecting them to send a postcard of a giant mouse or rabbit. And then he went on, he said, now, do a lot of people in the congregation play the lottery? And we went on just all evening, and we didn't want to stop about all these people. And he had cancer, or he'd had cancer surgery earlier in the year, and it recurred, and he died about 3 years later. So I like to remember this last visit. And one way to finish up about him is to quote a phrase that he used when he left St. Chrysostom's: those who love the Lord never meet for the last time.